Chapter 1, the purpose and promise of special education. I'll give you just a quick bit of history that there's been special education around for almost as long as there's been education. But in 1975 was the first official piece of legislation, federal legislation, that said schools must provide special education. Hence, most people would say that was the birth of special education. There have been special schools and all kinds of other programs, but that's the first time the feds got involved and said you will provide this. This is just the focus questions. Let me go back here, these same focus questions on the PowerPoint. These are also on the Chapter 1 page of the wiki, but these are the things that you need to be able to address by the end of this, and I'll try and walk you through this in this lecture. When is special ed needed? And how do we know? Disability labels do not tell us what and how to teach. Why do we use them? We spend a section on labeling, and then why have courts and federal legislation been required to ensure that children with disabilities receive a free and appropriate public education. And I don't think they deal with that very well here, but I will try and give you some insight on that, because it's all driven by federal legislation. Yeah, even though the Constitution says nothing about education, the feds, like so many things, they really run this completely. How can a special educator provide all three kinds of intervention: preventative, remedial, and compensatory compensation on behalf of the child? And that's really the crux of special ed services, is those things. And so you'll have to be familiar with those. In what ways do general and special education differ? And are those differences important? If so, why and how? And so by the end of this chapter, I would expect you'll have a good feel for those. And if you do, you'll be successful on the exam at the end. All right. So exceptional differ from normal children, either above or below. That's an interesting take here, that it could be above or below, to such an extent that they require special ed. If they don't require, then there's not a service, and that's why it's important that you understand those terms. Okay, impairment, disability, handicapped, and at risk. You have to distinguish them. I'm going to go back to the textbook and take a look at that. Right, and this is just the guest teacher here. Okay, so what are who are those exceptional children? And this is a kind of interesting read here on who they are. They differ from the norm, above or below, and exceptional children include children who experience difficulties in learning, as well as those who perform so advanced that mods and modifications in curriculum are necessary. So that's a little hard to get your head around in the education field, is they could be so far ahead. And what do we call those kids? Gifted. The only difference is there's no federal legislation for gifted. And in most schools, it used to be a separate program, but now most school districts, I know the Sioux Falls School District has put the gifted program in with special ed, and they call that exceptional children program. And so that's the term that you'll want to be familiar with, is exceptional children. And that's the term we use to describe kids that have any kind of a difference from the norm, above or below. Because it's not just those kids. It can also be kids that have, impairments and, injuries and things like that. So thus, exceptional children is an inclusive term that refers to children with learning and or behavior problems. Okay, so that's important too. There's learning or behavior problems, sensory impairments, or intellectual problems. Give you that again. This is what exceptional children is: learning and or behavior problems, and often those two come together. In fact, I'm starting to see people say you can't separate them. They really are challenged to find kids that meet the requirements for a learning disability that don't have some kind of a behavior problem with it. And we'll talk about that when we get to the chapter on behavior problems. Then children with physical disabilities, which you're very familiar with, or sensory impairments, and that's kind of come on in the last 20 years with autism, or more sensory impairments, and children with superior intellectual abilities or special talents, and those are gifted kids. So it goes on to say students with disabilities is more restrictive than exceptional children, because it does not include gifted and talented. Learning the definition of several related terms will help you better understand this. Okay, here's the thing on impairment, disabilities, and handicap, and you'll need to, like I said, really kind of master those differences. So impairment is the loss or reduced function of a body part or an organ, like a missing limb. So you can function with that and not be in special ed. That an impairment doesn't mean a disability. A disability exists when an impairment limits a person's ability to perform certain tasks. Okay, like walking, see at rows of numbers. Okay, a person with a disability is not handicapped, however, unless the disability leads to educational, personal, social, vocational problems. They're not a handicap is not a disability unless it leads to these problems. For example, a child who has lost a leg learns to use a prosthetic limb and functions in and out of school without problems. It's not a handicap, at least in terms of her functioning in the physical environment. So here's the handicap part. Handicap refers to a problem or disadvantage that a person with a disability or impairment encounters when interacting with the environment. A disability may pose a handicap in one environment, but not in another. A child with a prosthetic limb may be handicapped when competing against non-disabled peers in basketball court, but experience no disadvantage in the classroom. And of course, that's what we're after here, is the learning part. That we're not required to provide them with, to be on the basketball team. Not yet, anyway. Many people with disabilities experience handicaps that are the result of negative attitudes and inappropriate behaviors. So, and this textbook is real big on this social part of it. And now, let me just tell you again what that said. Many people with disabilities experience handicaps that are the result of negative attitudes and inappropriate behaviors of others who needlessly restrict their access to the ability to participate fully in school, work, or community. Now, it doesn't give you an example of that. See, and this is why this kind of bugs me, because they throw a statement out like that, and this is their opinion. Keyword is that this is his opinion, but he doesn't back it up. Give me some examples here where you see people's negative attitudes and inappropriate behavior, but he doesn't do that. He just throws it out there. So I don't think that's... Don't do that if you're ever authoring a book. And then the term at risk refers to children who, although not currently identified as having a disability, are considered to have a greater than usual chance of developing one. Educators often apply the term to infants, preschoolers who, because of biological conditions, events surrounding their births or environments, may experience developmental problems in later time. The term is also used to refer to students who are experiencing significant or learning problems in the general classroom and therefore at risk of diagnosed with a disability. So at risk is kind of a big one. And let me go back here and say, okay, here's the impairment, the loss or reduced function. Disability exists when an impairment limits the ability to perform certain tasks, and handicap, a problem encountered when interacting with the environment. Then here's the at risk. Okay, and this is interesting also, is we put this group in there, low income kids. Again, this guy is very politically correct. He wouldn't say that, but that's what he's inferring here when he talks about this group here. Environmental deprivation, biological condition, events surrounding their births, meaning single parent, low income, may be expected to experience developmental problems at a later time. In other words, their mom doesn't sit them on their lap and read to them, and so there's some kind of a delay in that ability. So here's your first input. You can stop this after I tell you, but you are going to give me one example for each of these from your world, somebody that you know, with a little explanation of that person from each of these. Someone that has an impairment, somebody that has a disability, somebody that has a handicap, or somebody that's at risk. 4 entries here, and each time when you come to this entry, make sure you turn that font red so I can see it, that you have it in there. Okay, so that's one. This is your first input. Stop this and put that now in your notes. Find this area in your note page and put those things in there. Stop it now. So how many exceptional children are there? What is this number? Well, this is very interesting. 7 million, okay, with a million, with ages birth to 21, and we'll talk about that later. But we start counting them when they're born, because you didn't know that. But your student, a child, can be eligible for special education when they're born, and they receive that during the and then 9, 10 years. So that's a couple years old already. But there were 7 million. This represents about 12% of the school-age population, 6 to 17. The last edition of this book, this is the 10th edition here, as you see way down here. That's the 10th edition. The last book I used was 8th edition. I skipped over the 9th, and this one was about 8.5% in the 8th edition. So in other words, since about 06, this thing has jumped 4%. And that can be a nice long discussion of where are these kids coming from? Why is this number going up? And I think it'll unfold as we go through the semester with the different chapters with disabilities. Okay, and this one is old news. Most of you know this. Twice as many males as females receive special education. And that'll come out too. But that's just a little thing you put back now. And we'll talk about that, why twice as many males as females. Okay. Percentage of students receiving SPED under the learning disability category has almost doubled, where the percentage of students with intellectual disabilities has decreased. Intellectual disabilities is now the term for MR, mental retardation, not politically correct. If you say the word mental retardation, you have misspoken, and people will think less of you. Now, they're still mentally retarded. They still have mental retardation, but like all political correctness in our world now, we don't say that. We say intellectual disabilities. And so there's less of those. And part of it is they've changed the criteria of what qualifies them for that. But the learning disabilities, and part of that group, too, is we're starting to really group kids in there with ADD and ADHD because we don't know what else to call them. They become delayed with that. And so that number, just chew on that a little bit. And again, remember what year I said special ed was born? 1975 was the birth of special ed, when they claimed at that time was this much. And now in 2010 and 11, it's 42%. So that means about 1 in 6 with disabilities ages 6 to 13 are declassified. That's a term. No longer receive special ed service 2 years later. In other words, they qualified at a point in their schooling, and now they don't. So let me go to the textbook, take a look at that. Flip the page here. Okay. Here are the group of the different disabilities. Okay, and how many are there? And it takes you through that, what we just went through. Since the government began reporting the child in this, and that's why, because that's when they first started reporting this. Was 96, 97, or 76, 77. It gives you that number. Now here, and this is a slide also you want to become familiar with, but this is the biggest group here. And that's going to be a question that'll be here and in other courses in the future. You have to know the biggest category, and that's a term you want to get in your vocabulary also, is category of special ed. Still the biggest, since its inception, is kids with learning disabilities. And we'll spend a whole chapter on learning disabilities. And then the second group, and this is very interesting because it's a very fluid group, is speech and language. And we'll do a chapter on speech and language. We'll do a chapter on almost all of these. But speech and language is the second. And the third, this is now surpassed intellectual. And this used to be MR. This used to be mental retardation. All right. Okay. Used to be mental retardation. Now intellectual disability. So that is slipped behind. And what is other health impaired? This is the ADHD, ADD one that has now surpassed That used to be other health impairment in edition 8 that I used before was way down here in these what we call low incidence disabilities. It is now the third overall. Largest group is learning disabilities. Second is impairments. Let me go back to this so I can write on a little bit. This other health impairment used to be down here. We call these we used to call these low incidence disabilities. LIDs, low incidence disabilities, and these were called high incidence disabilities, and the highest being learning disabilities. Okay. So then autism, and autism too used to be way down here, and look at how that skyrocketed. That one didn't even exist until about 1991, I think. Or 1990. Before that, there was no autism, and there was no traumatic brain injury till 1990. So that was an ad. And you can see some of these that have fallen off. You can hardly count these. And when you see these, like deaf blindness, even hearing impairments, visual impairments, brain injury, you could easily teach your entire career and not ever have anybody in your class that has some of those low incidence disabilities. Again, I want you to be familiar with those terms, low incidence disabilities. Okay, I'll go back to the text a minute. So those are the groups. I want to go back and see what it says about this. It kind of takes us off on this thing about this. So the number of school-age children with autism in 09-10 is 10 times more than the number classified autism 10 years earlier. So if you want to investigate something, this is what you can put your head to. What's going on that this number of kids with autism is 10 times what it was 10 years ago? Nobody's offering anything. There was some talk one time that was childhood immunizations. And it's so interesting in research that what I know about research just doesn't make sense is that researchers are saying it's not related to that. They have no idea what's causing it, but they've ruled out childhood immunizations. And where I come in from in research, I don't know how you rule it out if you have no idea what's causing it. So my suspicion is that plays some role, but again, that's politically incorrect to talk that way. I said that at one time to another professional, and he went ballistic on me, saying you're probably one of these fools that wouldn't have your children immunized. Well, I'm the fool that took my kids all the time to get their shots, and I could fit in that category fairly quickly if you ever watched your child get those shots 2 to 3 at a time, and you're never quite sure what for. But anyway, 613 are declassified, and I talked a little bit about that. Declassified, say, hey, you no longer qualify. And you won't understand that until we talk about how they qualify, but not here. And the federal law does not mandate sports for children who are gifted or talented. 3 million academically gifted children. So that's up to, what that means is it's up to the states or up to the local district to spend that extra money to provide this. But people will make a case for gifted, and we'll study one chapter on gifted. People that are gifted, they'll make a case that they need special services just like kids in special ed. That at times you could have a kid that's so far above that they too can't function in the regular school. So that's where that comes from. So why do we label and classify exceptional children? And we have this thing over the years, and again, you're too young to know this, but I remember living through this as these different names that we gave people that were, and back then, of course, somebody with disability was severely disabled. Kids with learning disabilities or tendencies towards autism or ADD, they weren't ever considered really disabled. People knew they would be different. But back that time, they didn't even know what to do with people that are severely disabled. Of course, it's come along years, and it gives you some names here that could have been dunce, imbecile, fool. If you see some of the old shows on TV that are in syndication now, you'll see how they portray these people. And, the characters, and I don't know what to do with them back then when they were black and white shows. What do you do with somebody that's disabled? So, they took able-bodied people and tried to make them play these roles that are about disabled. And so here, what labeling has to do with this, and it came from the federal law. This here says terms of common function exclude people with disabilities from the activities and privileges of everyday life. And again, to me, that is a very charged statement that Dr. Hayward doesn't have any backup here. Let me just throw this bomb out here. These terms shared a common function exclude people with disabilities. Okay, Dr. Hayward, give me some examples of where that happened. So to me, he throws out what I would say a very leftist comment here without any support to it. And you'll see throughout the book he does that. He throws bombs like that and doesn't have anything to back it up. What are you going to do? All right. So what is labeling? Under the Federal Individuals with Disability Act, IDEA, and we'll spend some time here in a minute talking about that, but that is the feds piece of legislation. To receive SPED and related services, a child must identify as having a disability. So they're not in special ed, of course, unless they're identified as having a disability, and they have to fit into one of those categories that we just looked at. And what's the biggest category? Anyone? That's right, learning disabilities. Okay, a student becomes eligible for SPED and related services because they have a disability in one of those categories. Some educators believe that labels used to identify and classify these stigmatize them. Okay, and so Dr. Hayward does that. He says some educators and say that it stigmatizes them. So again, throws that out. And then others argue that a workable system to classify children and their things using more pleasant terms minimize it. So this what he's saying here, Dr. Hayward here, goes back to what I said to you here, that this was changed to intellectual disability from MR to, what's his word? If I needed workable system to classify more exceptional learning needs, prerequisite providing that using a pleasant term to minimize that. So Dr. Hayward is agreeing that it's more pleasant terms that's put on there to minimize and then devalues this individual situation need for supports. Okay, and this is where I think it falls off a little bit. This falls apart on him is then you also lose a little bit what supports they need, because in our community, in our culture, if you say a person has mental retardation, most of us have an understanding of, number one, what that is, and number two, what their needs are, and so for supports, how different they are. If I said to you intellectual disability, more pleasant word, we're not quite sure what to do with that. Okay, so he goes on here. Kaufman, who is another guru in this field of textbooks, and notes that stigma of cancer was not eliminated by referring to those affected as people with prolific cells or challenging tissue. So Kaufman's making a little case against this. By changing the name, didn't change that. Labeling were complex issues involving emotional, political, and ethical, and this is his deal, political, and the ethical considerations, physical and exceptional interests. Let me tell you this. I started studying special ed in 1991, and we spent enormous amount of time in 1991 talking about this issue, about what labels, what should they be called. So here it takes you through the possible benefits of labeling, of giving their disability a name. Okay? And then it talks about the possible disadvantages. And you don't have to know all these, but you have to know some. Or you have to know the gist of it. What the advantages and disadvantages of labeling. And then they go into this thing as alternatives. Well, first of all, let me show you those possible benefits. Recognize meaningful differences in learning or behavior and in the first step in responding to differences. And so, in other words, two people that look alike, we can't see, especially the high incidence disabilities that are invisible. He doesn't talk about that here, but back in 1991, we talked about invisible, hidden. For example, a learning disability is not visible. Mental retardation is very visible. ADD often is invisible. Blind is very visible to people. Hearing can be visible. Orthopedically impaired and stuff like that. So you have to recognize the differences if you can't tell by seeing, and then provide access to accommodation services not available to persons without that label. Yeah, because we wouldn't provide some of the same SPED, special ed services, to somebody with mental retardation, with intellectual disabilities that didn't have that label. And then this one helps practitioners, and that's a fancy word for the teachers. And the reason we use that, because in special education, that is very inclusive of a whole group of people that provide service and work with kids that aren't always teachers, but it's a fancy word for the teachers. And researchers communicate with one another and classify and evaluate research findings. So yes, we need those to communicate things about working with the kids and research. We got to have some term that helps us zero in on specific things. And this is interesting, more acceptance by peers. What does that mean? Because normally we're just saying how that stigmatizes, but it helps if I understand that somebody has a learning disability, I may accept them more. That one's kind of weak. And the basis of funding and resources for research and other programs. Okay. Get more money for kids with more severe disabilities, and then makes exceptional children's needs more visible to policymakers. Okay, here's the politics. And I'm sorry, this is what drives it. This thing right here. How do we get more? As everything we do. More. All right? That's all we know. We don't know how much we need. We just need more. Often when we ask about education, all we say is that we're underfunded. We never put an amount. What would it take to make it functional? Yeah, I know this is a tangent, but I'm just saying. In education, we create a bunch of what I would call victims, teachers that think they're victims, and all we say is we need more money, but what more is it? Now we have a term fair share, and that has no meaning either. So if we need more funding for education, what does that mean? 3%, 10%, 50%, 80%? If we increase funding in education 80%, I guarantee in 3 years we would say we need funding for education. Yeah, don't get get me started on that. So here's the disadvantages. So you saw the advantages, disadvantages. If you do, sometimes this, and this is absolutely true. This is absolutely true. This is more true than those two, that the teacher may have lower expectations because they have a disability. It may negatively affect their self-esteem, and I would take some issue with that, because I've seen kids who were relieved to find out they had a disability, and I've worked with people that find out as an adult they have some of those high incidence disabilities that was never diagnosed because they were always functional. Yes, this one. Yes, this one. Yes, this one includes disproportionate number, and that's a big word that we talk about, and that is disproportionate. Means if a number is proportionate, it should be representative of everybody else in the school. So let me do it like this. Say, for example, that you let me do this. So what is disproportionate? Well, let me do it like this. Disproportionate means it should be the same proportions as there is in school. So for example, let's just say, for an easy figure, we have 1,000 kids in our school. My boys go to a middle school that has a few more than that. So we say we do a head count, which we do. We count every single kid for minority status because that's a politically correct thing to do. So let's just say we have we count of our 1,000 kids. We find that 30% are African American. Okay, so that would say proportionately, there shouldn't be 30% of 1,000 is 300. There shouldn't be any more than 30% of our SPED kids be African American. So if there's 40% of all SPED kids are African American, that's disproportionate, and this is what the media and society have you believe, that this is disproportionate. Now, the group I worked with that was always disproportionate are the Native Americans. For some reason, in the school where I taught, they represented about 17% of the student body, and they were about 33% in SPED. So that was a disproportionate number. So know that, not only this, but going forward on all kinds of things in school. And of course, this is politically correctness, should say it should never be disproportionate. Everything should match. Requires the last one, expenditure that might be better spent on planning and delivering instruction. And what does that mean? And counting those. Now, here, let me take a divergent here on disproportionate on this. What about, you want to be politically correct with different ethnic groups? How about athletics? Yeah, how about athletics? What percentage of kids that are African American are on the basketball team compared to the school? Oh, I got a bigger one? This will blow you away. What about fat kids? Shouldn't we have a proportionate set aside for the varsity basketball team that are overweight kids to proportionate to the school? Just kidding ya. All right, let's go on. Let me go back to the text here. I want to correct one thing here on this. There's a question on the test under this one, and I haven't talked about it, a developmental delay. And what that is, at some ages 3 to 9, and you have to know that on test, that this is ages 3 to 9. It's a small group, age 3 to 9. Know that for the test. And that is the group that we don't really, when they're age 3, we don't really have a category yet if they're just struggling to keep up to their norms. At that point, it's all about measuring about what they can do. Of course, they can't read or anything in those years at age 3, but maybe they can't stand on one foot. They don't know colors. They don't know their name or something like that. They're delayed. So that's age 3 to 9. Okay. Went through this, the things of labeling. Possible disadvantages. I talked to you about disproportionate and apportionate and proportionate. Yeah, disproportionate, proportionate. Meaning, if it's proportionate, it should be equal representation. If 30% of the kids are fit one group are in school, that should be in disability. And what really gets interesting here is these low-income kids. Of course, because we would classify, for example, where I taught, is right about 76% of the kids got free or reduced lunches. And so that school, and the school there was about 25% then were in special ed. So at least that wasn't proportionate, it was less than. All right, so what are the laws governing? This is the laws. Again, this isn't anybody's laws, this is the feds. Said that we had an exclusionary pass. Okay, let me look at the textbook here a second. This is still about labeling. I said this was the alternative to labeling. Let me just talk a little bit about that. Have suggested that special ed be classified according to the curriculum or skill areas they need to learn. But it should refer to these special by using those old labels, and how should we refer to them? And one of the things with that is it becomes that old tracking thing. Jose, beyond that, labeling include perspectives of several people with disabilities and current issues and future trends. What's the name, the labels, those things. So there's no clear thing. So what are the laws? Well, first of all, an exclusionary pass, and Dr. Hayward does a nice job of pointing that out. Society can be judged by the way it treats those who are different. And again, I say this is a bizarre stance to take because we didn't know what to do with them back then. And what's interesting now is we look back and say, oh my gosh, we were horrible people than the way we took care of them. And that's what he's referring to here. That we can be judged by the way we treat those who are different. The U.S. educational system has a less than distinguished history. And I'm saying we didn't know any better, Dr. Hayward, neither did you. And so to go on to this kick that, oh, we're bad educational system, I think is wrong. Children who are different because of race, culture, language, gender, socioeconomic status are exceptionally and often been denied full and fair access to educational opportunities. So at least he does cite a researcher here, a very recent one, trying to justify what he's saying. It's important, however, to note that the past practices were not entirely negative. Long before there was any legal requirements to do so, people were getting that services. Okay? Thank you, Dr. Hayward, for acknowledging that. Many children with disabilities were entirely excluded from publicly supported. What do? We taught them in separate institutions and stuff, and that's what he's referring to, and that's absolutely true. That the children's care hospital and school used to be crippled children, used to be chock full of kids. Those kids that were at children's care then, back when I was learning this, were far, far more mildly disabled than they are now. Now to be at children's care, they're much more severely disabled. But there was institutions and special schools all over. This is where these kids were. It was until 1975 that they said they had to come into the public school, into the regular school. For the 70s, laws in many states permitted public schools to deny enrollment of children with disabilities. One state law, for example, allowed schools to refuse to serve children with physically or mentally incapacitated to do schoolwork. Okay, and again, I'm saying we didn't know any different. What people felt it was not worth the money, and you know how much time and money it takes to educate these. Another state had a law stipulating that children with bodily or mental conditions rendering attendance inadvisable could be turned away, and when these cases were contested, the nation's courts generally supported exclusion. Then, in 1919, a case example, a 13-year-old student with physical disabilities but normal intellectual, okay, and that's really what turned it. That's really what turned the whole thing around, was had physical disabilities but was a normal intellectual, was excluded from high school because a procedure produces a depressing and nauseating effect on teachers and school children. Okay, and again, very politically incorrect. I'd love to have this conversation with you. It's politically incorrect, but there's some effect to this. One of the things I call it is the shock factor, the shock effect of people with severe disabilities. But you're not supposed to say that. You're not supposed to talk about it. You're supposed to just accept this. So this is what they said. He's quoting another author, textbook author, 2004, page 4, saying that he couldn't come because it would produce this depressing and nauseating effect. Then when public schools began to accept the measure of responsibility for education, philosophy and practice of segregation prevailed. Children with disabilities were confined to segregated classrooms, isolated from students and teachers in the general program. One SPED teacher described the crude facilities in which her special ed operated in the sense isolation is this, and she goes on to tell you how horrible it was. So children with mild disabilities and behavior problems usually remained in the general education classroom but received no special help prior to the 70s. Those did not make satisfying progress, were slow learners, simply failures, and of course a lot of them left school. And it was at a time where we were more of an agrarian society that they were still, a lot of those kids were successful that they would never be now. And so this is one of the big changes in our society. Not good to talk about that, but so society's response to exceptional children has come a long ways. As concept of freedom and stuff. Let me move on here. So we had this exclusionary pass. We no longer see them with disabilities as not being worthy. So then separate is not equal. So when we first had this law, then we said we'll provide the special services, but it'll be over there in that school. And it's closely related to the civil rights movement. And again, I disagree with that statement, but he can throw that out without support of that. He's saying this is a civil rights issue, and that's how it went down, that the kids with disabilities had that also. A little over dramatic, but it got the results they wanted. Special ed was strongly influenced by social developments and court decisions in the 50s and 60s, especially Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka. A little black girl wanted to go to the neighborhood school, and they said, no, we've got to provide education for the black kids, but not here. It's down at the other school down the street. And the court ruled that separate is not equal, that if you separate kids, it's not an equal treatment. And so that's a period of intense questioning about parents and children with disabilities who asked the same things. Parents and other advocates dissatisfied with the system that denied equal access to children initiated that 70s, that first law. And then equal protection is a whole other thing. Not only did the court rule that all children with intellectual disabilities were entitled to a free and public education, a FAPE, but also stipulated that the placement in general classrooms and regular were preferable to segregated settings. So, and this comes from this one, and this is on the test. You have to know what this is. PARC, the Pennsylvania Association of Retarded Children, challenged the law that denied public school children with considerable unable to profit from the public schools. Okay, and the lawyers and parents supporting PARC argue that even though the children had intellectual disabilities, it was neither rational nor necessary to assume that they were educatable. And because the state was unable to prove that the children were in fact ineducatable, or demonstrate rational need for this, they were entitled to a FAPE, a free and appropriate public education. The court ruled that parents had the right to be notified before any change was made to their educational program. So that's what PARC did. But PARC thing is that they now allowed for education of kids with mental retardation. There, I said it again. I'm sorry. With intellectual disabilities. I'm telling you, back then it was mental retardation. But that's what PARC does. The Pennsylvania Association of Retarded Children versus the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania got the courts to say kids with mental retardation or intellectual disabilities could be in the schools. Okay. So let me take you back to this. Separate is not equal. Children with difficulty have often been denied full fair access. Special education was strongly influenced by social developments and court decisions in the 50s and 60s. Brown and, like I said, the one on the test, I don't think Brown is, but PARC is. So you have to know what PARC did. PARC versus Commonwealth. And then all children are entitled to a FAPE. And this is a term that I'll use, a FAPE. And that's what you want to be familiar with, a free, appropriate, public education. And that's what the result of this in 1975 said. All, regardless of disability, or creed, color, minority background, are entitled to a FAPE. And now even undocumented children. I was going to say illegal immigrants, but that too is politically incorrect. So it's a FAPE. They are undocumented. All right, let's move on to that next one, the Individual Disabilities Act. And this is that piece of legislation. It was called something else in 1975. But this was the feds getting involved, said we'll take it from here, ensure that all children have available to them a FAPE. The rights of the children with disabilities and their parents are protected, and they enjoy special rights that other children don't, and to assist state and local education agencies providing for the educationists. And what that means is money. And it is one of the former governors of South Dakota said that when this was passed, the feds promised to pay 100% of a state's expenses for special services. And at that time he was speaking, he said it's about 15%. And so this 85% in here comes from the state. And the state gets their money from, you. Okay, so assist states in implementation of this statewide system of early intervention. Okay, early intervention was because at first it was just school age. And then early intervention said, at age 3, and I remember when this was implemented in about 1993, age 3 to 5, preschool, necessary tools for available to improve education results with children with disability. This is the idea. And to assess and ensure the effectiveness of efforts to educate children with disabilities. So that was all part of that federal law. Let's go back to the textbook and get a look at that. And it gives you more of an explanation of those. All right. And so what I'm going to ask you to do here is give me, from the textbook, put one more line, simplify this, give me one line instead of all this. Give me 4 lines that sum this up better in terms that you'll understand. So this is your second input, 4 lines, and again, remember, turn it red. It'll be in your notes. Come in between here and give me one line that tells me you understand this in terms that you understand. And you can use these right here for further explanations. And then here are the 6 principles, and you absolutely will have to be familiar with these heretofore. And whenever there's a conversation about special ed, it will involve the 6 principles of IDEA. And you can use major principles, but the principles of IDEA, and I'm just going to hit them quickly: 0 reject, non-discriminatory identification and evaluation, a FAPE, we just talked about that, least restrictive environment, we call it LRE, due process safeguards, and shared decision making. Okay. What I'm going to ask you to do, this is your entry number 3, is where you stop it and come to this, is you put one sentence from the description that deals with each of these. So there's 1, 2, 3, you'll have 6 sentences here, and in that sentence you tell me, okay, like for here, 0 reject, must educate all children with disabilities. What does that mean to your school? And you can think of it in terms of the school where you attended formal school or the one you'll be teaching is, but what does that rule, what does that principle mean to that school? And don't tell me it must educate all children with disabilities. What does it mean to the school? How did that principle change your school? And that's what you'll do with each one of these. So stop this. Let me take you back to the textbook. Here's the full explanation of what these are. And you will give me one sentence for each of those, what that principle means. Okay? Six principles. So here's the other provisions of IDA. Special education school for preschoolers, and that's why I said age 3 to 5. Infants and toddlers are birth to 3. And again, we will do a study on this, but I'll just tell you, what do you do in special ed from 0 to 3? Well, this is called family assistance. You're not providing special ed at this point, you're providing services to the family. So it's family involvement here is what. But again, I'm going to ask you, this will be your number 4. You give me a sentence of each of these. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 of these, what each of those are. Let me take you back to the text and show you where those are. This is the related services. I'll talk about in a second. Okay, that's the rest of that. And here's those other provisions. So you will bring out of here a provision for each of those. And again, you'll turn them red. You'll turn the text red on your notes before you submit it, so I can tell exactly where you're at. Okay. All right. So that's that. That's your 4th one. And here's a related legislation. Let me take you back to the text on this one. And here's the related things. Some talk about the FAPE, least restrictive environment. Realize how courts have resolved the various legal challenges. Many different judicials exist for this. Federal statute of the regulations. Okay, so been lots of court challenges, and we'll study that a little bit. Extended school year was part of that. Armstrong versus Klein. That you can have longer school year. Okay, here's just a part of it. FAPE and related services. And what that said was, and this is Board of Education versus Raleigh, but it determined in a short period of time after special ed was born in 75 that kids with severe disabilities may need other services other than what the school provides in order to be successful in school. And so with that came related services. Okay, let me take you back here to related services. No, that's over here. Couple pages of related services saying you may need this to be successful. There was about 14 of them: audiology service, counseling service, early identification assessment, interpretation services, medical services, OT, orientation mobility, parent counseling, physical therapy. All these could be part of the IEP so the student can have a FAPE, because the course determined sometimes they couldn't get a FAPE unless they also got some of these services. It's got kind of long and exhaustive here, including social work, school language, transportation, exceptional services that apply to children with surgically implanted devices, and that's new. Okay, so you may need related services. You may need related services, and so that becomes part of the IEP. Okay. Okay, here's the other provisions. All right. So then this related legislation, and there's continually ongoing court challenges regularly for this. So here's the legal challenges. One is extended school year, related services, disciplining students. Lots to do hubbub about disciplining students. Stewart versus Nappy is one of them. Let me just hit on a couple things here. One is this 99-457 is on the test. So you have to know what 99-457 has to do with. Okay, and you see it cited through here. So early interventions, assistive technology is new, probably a new piece. You have to know what that does. Any piece of equipment that a product required that helps them basically. And then scientifically based instruction, you have to have a feel for that. The UDL, Universal Design, what does that have to do in your inputs? That. Then here are the legal challenges of it. The FAPE, you know, who's entitled to the FAPE. The extended school year. And again, Armstrong versus Klein challenged the extended school year. FAPE and related services, and I took you through that list of related services. Again, we'll talk about the 100ch1sp13 and versus Raleigh cases, related services. And then here's this about disciplining students, and there's a couple things that go with that, and it's changed in recent times. 97 they changed it, but saying they can't be expelled in excess of 10 days. If they do, the IEP team has to meet and come up with another plan for them, and that's called a manifestation determination. And what that is you get together and determine, is this behavior related to their disability? If they have intellectual disability or learning disabilities, do they know what they're doing is right or wrong? And then you have to change their placement. But the schools are still protected. They were forced to come here farther in 04. Let's come back to this and say, but if a student brings a gun or weapon or drugs or hurts somebody or fights, they can still have the same consequences up to 45 days. If not, you have to change the placement, meaning you have to change where they go to school. And then a right to education goes back to the zero reject, Timothy versus the Rochester, and we'll study Timothy, the effect Timothy had on special ed also. So that all goes in your notes. Then this related legislation, this JAVIS Gifted and Talented really is money, was a worthy program to provide additional funding for gifted. It said here 3 million gifted and talented in the United States were lucky this, but Dr. Hebert's still claiming it's chronically underfunded, and they got that from the Council of Exceptional Children, who wants money. So you question research by people that benefit from research coming out the way they want it. Okay, Section 504 is states that no otherwise qualified handicapped individuals shall solely by reason of handicap be excluded from participation in this. So what that was an outcome of, it says 73 and it's been updated many times, but what they found is people that had disabilities sometimes were excluded from jobs or things like that because it would be too much work to have them there if they had a disability. Not provide any federal money to do this, and that's the one difference between 504 and school. But 504 isn't an education thing. It could be implemented in school, but it would really come on. It had to do with like architecture and stuff like that, architectural accessibility for students in the schools. And ADA was an outgrowth of that, dealt with employment, public entities, those things, public accommodations, telecommunications. And the Elementary and Secondary Act, No Child Left Behind. What was the thing? And what that Congress tried to do is put accountability in learning. Of course, the teachers went nuts, schools went nuts. They didn't want to be accountable for learning, for kids learning. But the thought was they had to make this annual progress. By the year 2014, all kids would be making adequate yearly progress. And so it was an accountability piece, that we'd had many pieces of federal legislation and education prior to that never added accountability, and finally the legislature put accountability in, and people went nuts. Didn't want to be accountable. Scientifically based instruction, you will determine what that is, and implications for students with disabilities, with accommodations. What are accommodations? I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, so what is special education today? Well, has these things as a preventative thing. Let me go back to our notes on this. Here's those pieces. Gifted, 504, extended civil rights to people with disabilities, extended civil rights protection to private sector, going to get them bad private people going. And then this Elementary Secondary Act, like No Child Left Behind. Improve the achievement, particular emphasis on children with low-income families. I say nobody wanted that. And then states are experienced to make annual progress. They have to use scientifically based instruction. That was a big uproar. It puts a special emphasis on using educational programs and practices that rigorously scientific research has demonstrated to be effective. Okay. Including those with disabilities, and that was the one people screamed about the most. So what is it? Well, it's preventative, becoming, and there's 3 levels of that: primary, secondary, and tertiary. And then remedial, attempt to eliminate the effects of it. And then compensatory, enable successful functioning in despite of the disability. And on the test, it gives you some scenarios, and you determine which of these is it: preventative, remedial, or compensatory. All right. And then what is special ed as instruction? Exceptional children whose educational needs necessitate an individualized planned program. So special ed is someone that needs special instruction, needs the IEP. They're not involved in special ed unless they need that service. Special ed can sometimes be differentiated from general education by its curriculum. Differs from the general ed by specialized and adapted materials and methods. So that's how it's different. There's a question on the test, how is it different? And special ed can sometimes be identified but not defined by where it takes place. It says you have to have a plethora of things. We call it a continuum of places to provide services. Here's that history I was talking about. All the things that came along prior to this. Here's 75 is the first law. Oh, here it is, 94-142. And what I want you to do, I have you put it right here. Right here. Put this in your note. I think this is number 5. Is what does 94-142 stand for? What does that number stand for? So stop this, go to your notes, and put down what that number stands for in this discussion. All right. We go back here to what is special ed. Here's the history of it. I say you come down, get to 84, and you'll see it's reauthorized. They finally changed the name in 1990, I believe it was. To IDEA. It was the first time it was called IDEA was in 1990. Then Golds, 2000, that was President Clinton. Then 97. Every 7 years has to be reauthorized. And that was by the first legislation. So 97, and then of course in 04 it was reauthorized again. Every time it's assigned again. And this gives you a little synopsis of what changed in that piece of thing. And this tells you what these different ones are. Who's involved, because it could be the general ed and the regular ed teacher. What, how, and where. So here is this continuum definition of educational environments for students. Right? So this would be considered the least restrictive. The least restrictive placement would be the regular classroom. Spends at least 80% of their time in the regular class. The most restrictive is this one, homebound hospital. So this is considered a continuum of services. So the least restrictive, the next level of restriction is a resource room called pullout. Spend at least 40 to 79% of the school day inside the regular classroom. Then they would be considered a pullout student. Or the next one is a separate classroom, and often kids with mental retardation, with multiple or intellectual disabilities, spend 40% of the day in regular class, less than. So that we call that kind of a self-contained. Then a separate school. There may be reasons they need to be in a separate school or a residential facility where they may need to live there even for whatever their disability is. Yes, Children's Care Hospital and School would be that. Okay, that would be a continuum of services, and the government says you have to provide this and different ability or placement of environments in your school. So, for example, you're a small school like Madison, like Rutland, Oldham Ramona, and a child moves into your district that needs, a separate school or residential facility or home hospital care. What do? Well, you buy that service then from someplace else. Your district would buy service from Children's Care Hospital and School. And this is a look at percentage of school-age students with disabilities served in different educational environments. So they're saying nearly 60% are regular classroom, and then 20% resource, all the way down. So you can see, by far, most kids are served in the regular classroom. And this is what special ed is. Goes back to this. Who, what, where, when, and how. And it has to be individually planned, and this will be your last one, your last entry. And what I'm going to ask you to do is come right here before this page and after this page. Right here is you get to bring in these things about special ed, and give me one line. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 things. 6 things with one line for each one in your notes. So this is number 6, I believe. Did I say? Or 5? Yeah, number 6 here. You'll bring in 6 things from page 34 right here, and you'll make them in red, but you'll tell me what are defining features of special ed. Let's call it that, the dimensions of special ed. Okay, so you have 6 things total to bring in here, 6 places in your notes where you'll stop. Alright, let's finish this. The current trends. Let me just go see where the textbook goes now. Current challenges, things, yeah. And these are ongoing, this research to practice gap, and that's because the incubator for research office at the university level, which isn't always real applicable back to the K-12 classrooms. Improve the quality of pre- and in-service training programs so all educators meet the professional standards. And that's why the SPED majors still get so many jobs in a regular classroom, because of this one. Increase the availability of quality of SPED programs for gifted and talented students. Help students with disabilities transition from school to adult life. Apply advances in technologies that reduce or eliminate the disabling effects. Increase access to assistive technology, which I thought would be dramatically different by now. Okay, that is the Chapter 1 lecture with 6 different places for inputs. And each time you will turn them red so I can see them in your notes and submit them.